Oh, Rebecca Schatz, Rabbi Rebecca. It's wonderful. Oh, in America, you say Rabbi Schatz. It's wonderful to have you, to welcome you to our Parsha recording for this week, Parsha Bahalotcha. You're a wonderful and amazing friend, somebody who I learned with and who looked after me amazingly when I arrived in Los Angeles for the first time, straight off the boat into the rabbinical school of the Ziegler School for Rabbinical Studies. You a rabbi who works at Temple Beth Am, and it's lovely to welcome you in Los Angeles. It's lovely to welcome you all the way from Los Angeles now. It's like literally the middle of the night there. The stars are all still out, and it's very kind of you to come early in the morning to enable this recording. I was really, we're going to get straight into Parsha. I was really taken this week by just a couple of verses of our Torah portion, which speak to a question, a shaila, which is put by the people to Moshe. The people say, if we're unclean and we can't sacrifice the Passover sacrifice, can we have a do-over? And Moshe says, hold it right there. I'm going to speak to this God character and get an answer. And they come back, and the answer is yes, you can have a Pesach Sheni, a second chance to make the Passover sacrifice a month later. And not only that, but anybody who's not in the vicinity of the Mishkan or in future years in the vicinity of the temple can also benefit from that second chance. It seems to be a wonderful piece of Torah, both that there's she'ilot, like religious questions being framed in the desert to Moshe, who doesn't have the answer, who then speaks to this divine entity, and also seems to be a reflection, both biblically and rabbinically, that we're constantly trying to expand the parameters of second chances and of inclusion from the very inception of our religious life. I'd love to hear some of your Torah, and I'm really happy to welcome you.
It's really lovely to be here, and it is 8 a.m. So if that is the middle of the night for people, I am very impressed. I do think that it's about second chances, and I do think that it's about being able to see ourselves as not a people that necessarily need to do things in the exact moment, but rather that they just need to happen. So when I was thinking about this topic and thinking about when I've most thought about Pesach Sheni, it was actually last year when moments after COVID really became a reality for us here in America. We had Pesach and we didn't know what to do. And many people, both jokingly and also seriously, said, well, how about Pesach Sheni? Because we weren't sure how long COVID was going to last. And we thought, okay, maybe right now Pesach is really hard, but maybe if we wait a little longer, the exact month after Pesach, we'll be able to do this thing called Pesach Sheni. And I think that there's something very powerful about not needing Pesach to be on the specific day that the Torah tells us it needs to be. That's obviously the ideal. So lechatchila, right? Like the from the outset, you would want to celebrate Pesach on that day. But if something is to happen or you're unable to, b'diavad, in the kind of aftermath, you can celebrate this thing called Pesach Sheni. And I think the important part of that is not, oh, you can have this second chance, but rather it gives the first chance, the optimal moment of Pesach, the lack of stress, the lack of, if you cannot do it in that moment, there's another opportunity for you to do it. And so for me, that's the Torah telling us it's not about it being on this specific day, but rather it's about what Pesach means, what you experience, what you're supposed to imagine yourselves having done as part of this Exodus story, and to make sure that every year you have that. That's the important piece.
Interesting. So Pesach was several months ago, and there isn't really such thing as Pesach Sheni anymore, but people do keep Pesach Sheni in terms of bringing a little bit of Pesach to that day a month afterwards. One of the people in one of my communities suggested that she eats matzah brai, finishing the matzah of Pesach Sheni, to kind of mark it in some small way. It's not something that we have as an aspect of our religious tradition today. And I guess specifically, we do have a Pesach where the Seder night, which is the most practiced religious moment in the Jewish calendar, does only happen in Nisan, at the beginning of one of the beginnings of the Jewish year. So, but I guess that's a beautiful Torah, and a Torah that I often like to teach, that whilst we only mark, like the last festival that we had, Shavuot, we only mark the receiving of Torah once a year. We only mark Yetziat Mitzrayim once a year at Passover, the leaving of the Israelites from Egypt. We only mark the miracle of Hanukkah once a year normally in December, in Kislev. But somehow what you're speaking to, which I love, is that rollover of the aspects of the festival into the rest of the year. The core lessons that we learn from each festival are also held in our prayers and held in our consciousness throughout the year. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, I think so. The biggest piece of Pesach is that we're supposed to imagine ourselves having actually gone through that experience, having been those slaves, having been the people that was redeemed. And so I think that what the Torah is reminding us, and you're right, we don't celebrate Pesach Sheni, but to your last point, which I hadn't thought of, we talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim every day, and specifically every week when we recite Kiddush. So there are elements of Pesach that come throughout our daily practice, which no other holiday really does for us as frequently. And so Pesach Sheni to me feels like, yes, a second chance, but not of timing, rather of experience.
Right. So then the next part is where the rabbis go, and there seems to be a machloket, an argument or a bust up between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva says that anybody who was outside the boundaries beyond Modi'in, which is like maybe 15-20 kilometers from Jerusalem, can celebrate Pesach Sheni, can do it in a month later. And Rabbi Eliezer says anybody who's just outside the temple confines. And it's a fascinating like little glance at the rabbinic world, because in both instances there's a minimal framing for who can shelve Pesach number one, shelve the primary festival, and go to Pesach number two, which is like the kind of the B tickets. It was way too busy. There was too much going on in the temple at that time. I just didn't. We were learning in my Parsha class last night, 7:30 p.m. on a Wednesday. Be there. We just didn't have. I didn't quite have the energy for Pesach one. I didn't have the emotional, spiritual capacity to be there, to show up on Pesach one. So I'm going to go for Pesach two the month later. But there's a real, in that, guys, there's a real toss-up, because on one hand, we have a Torah, a rabbinic tradition, a religious tradition, which is really strict. Prayer 3 times a day, eat a certain way, live a certain way, do shvut on Shabbat, do rest on Shabbat, and 613 times for the 613 commandments. And yet, we do have many examples. The classical one I'm thinking about is the breaking of the second of the 10 commandments, which is a representation of the possibility of second chances. Many examples in our Torah of inclusion and second chances. But I guess the question I have from this week is, which is it? Is it a very strict rabbinic religious code where we're called on to take very seriously all of these different commandments? Or is it a Torah of inclusion, acceptance, and maximal inclusion for people who aren't quite up for it on that day?
It's a really hard thing. Yeah, it's a really hard thing to decide, because when you first mentioned the idea of rechokav, being far away, I was thinking about how the distance is actually what brings this this custom closer to people, right? Because just go with me for a second. I know that really didn't make sense. But if people are far away and so they can't do the Pesach sacrifice on the day that it's supposed to happen, what they know, even in that distance, is that they are close enough to their tradition that they have another chance to do it. So even with distance comes that closeness, because I mean, using COVID as another example, right? We were far away from how we normally practice Pesach, and yet we became closer to our identity of what Pesach really means, because we had to focus on those things and not the how many kosher grocery stores can I go to find the specific shmura matzah that I've been eating since I was 5 years old. So the things that are actually closest to our tradition are the things that are brought close when we are far away from that which we're used to. So in terms of your question of which one, I wonder if they actually go hand in hand. I wonder if when we are furthest away from that which is the routine that you're talking about in Judaism, do we actually find that closeness? I was talking to a current college student this week about her struggles through keeping Shabbat on a college campus as opposed to keeping Shabbat in her own family's home. And I said to her that sometimes when you are trying to find your own identity and you're trying to figure out who you are, that's coming because of distance. But in fact, you become closer to that which you want to be and that which Judaism means to you, because you are now in a place where you are being forced to figure out what's meaningful and what is actually that which you want to bring close. I know I keep using the words close and far, but just to hone in on that point.
It's a beautiful way to begin to conclude our teaching for today. I believe the Morinayim, the Pizetzner Rebbe, speaks of having to go down in order to come up, like the classic Hasidic version is of madregas, of steps, of madrigot. And the teaching is that somehow we need to do this alor v'chazor, like the coming in and coming out, in order to get to a spiritual higher place. Sometimes you necessarily have to step down and come back up again in order to do that spiritual refinement. So that speaks very nicely to your understanding of distance, and I think that's definitely seems to be borne out in some of the in the Parsha this week. We have to close here. I'd love to hear. I want to thank you for agreeing to do this. Super fun to see you and learn with you. And I'll just give you a final word to leave us with.
So one of the things that I'm about to, in 15 minutes, teach on this same topic, because I was so taken with it when you asked me to speak on it with you. And one of the things I've been thinking about in the preparation for my own teaching and also in this conversation is that there are so many pieces of our life right now that are coming, at least in America, that are coming back together, where that closeness is coming back together. But we still are in recognition of that distance. So even though we are on campus at my shul right now for services, there's still distance between you and the other person sitting next to you. And so in terms of Pesach Sheni, I hope that we can think about the fact that there is a world of second chances. There is a world in which that closeness can happen, can present itself, even if distance needs to be there in that moment. And just to you, because we are at a distance, I think that there's something to be said also for relationships, that when there is someone further away from you than they used to be, whether because they live on a different continent or because they are not currently in your pod, in your proximity in this world right now, that there are other ways of finding that closeness. You and I probably would have never done a class like this had the world been normal. But this is a closeness that now your world, my world, will get to experience, that hopefully brings light to a time that is full of distance. So I think that Pesach Sheni can be that for everybody, that even if it just means bringing out that matzah brai or bringing out your favorite Pesach recipe that month after Pesach, that we should be able to figure out what Pesach really means to us and the intricacies of the exact moment that Pesach is supposed to happen, but that Pesach Sheni can be really a second chance for us to bring back, reminisce, find that closeness to Passover yet again later on in our year.
Great. Thanks, Schatz.